Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about an interesting thing, well, at least a portion of it anyway, girly thoughts. People might wonder, well, what's that all about? Well, today the book is The Resilient Woman. It's Mastering the 7 Steps to Personal Power. And our guest joining us here on the program today is an internationally recognized psychologist, coach, and public speaker for her work on women, trauma, and substance abuse. She was also one of the first researchers in children of alcoholics in the early 1970s, documenting the impact of alcoholism and sobriety on adolescent development, and went on to create the Department of Prevention and Education for the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. Although we're going to be talking about resilience today, I thought it was important for the listeners to know this is someone with quite an array, quite a background when it comes to, let's say, trauma and disappointment, and what it is to be able to face discouragement and be resilient enough to move through those times in your life that you might find that there is no end. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Patricia O'Gorman. Dr. O'Gorman, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Well, it is my pleasure. Thank you. What a nice introduction.
Well, you know, when you've got someone like you who's been around, this isn't just another one of those 7-step books that somebody creates based on a thesis, but you've rolled up your sleeves and you've really done the work and you've been in there in the middle of it all. Tell us about your experience with this.
Well, this is my 8th book, and it is my 2nd book on women and resilience. I wrote my first book on women and resilience 19 years ago, and that book was called Dancing Backwards in High Heels. And as with
there's a challenge.
Well, yeah, but it's what we women do.
Right.
We dance backwards and in high heels. And my mother, who was in her golden years, a professional ballroom dancer before it became so popular on TV. I mean, she would go out and compete, you know, at a pretty high level. And she was always fascinated with Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. And she always talked to me about how hard Ginger Rogers' job was because she had to do everything Fred Astaire did, except she had to do it backwards in high heels. And she, you know, focused me on the tasks that women have, which is to make the men in their life, I mean, this goes back a while ago, look good and make it all look effortless. Mm-hmm. So I wrote my first book on women and resilience 19 years ago, and then, you know, went on to write some other things. And I'm a psychologist. I actively practice. I've held administrative positions, you know, some of them at very high levels. And part of me was always this idea of women resilience was always nagging at me because I realized nothing really had changed. I mean, a lot had changed, but many things hadn't changed. And what hadn't changed is how women treated themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's where the concept of girly thoughts come from. It's how, as women, we allow in these messages that are now all over the media, you know, in songs, you know, in TV shows, in books we read, certainly in magazines, about how we're supposed to look and how we're supposed to act, and the narrow band that puts us in and the consequences for not fulfilling that. And the reality is that in this time of electronic media, so many of these images that we are trying to live up to at whatever age we are are all digitally changed. So it's not even we're trying to compete with a real woman like Marilyn Monroe or with Gwyneth Paltrow, but these images have all been changed, you know, with the advent, you know, of plastic surgery, with photoshopping. Even the women don't look like themselves. And I had in a radio call-in show right after my book was released, a woman call in and identify herself as an over 50 model, and she said that she thought she was having girly thoughts because every day she woke up and she looked in the mirror and she felt sad that she didn't look like her. Well, the her she didn't look like was the digitally changed, made-up version of herself. But, you know, it made me feel so sad when she said that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what as women we do to ourselves. So the approach in my book was, okay, if this is what we're doing to ourselves, then we have to identify it, name it, and my 7 steps are all about how not to do it.
And it's very thorough, too. You know, as I was reading through The Resilient Woman, I realized that you come to a place where the first part to start with is paying attention to your conversation, your own little conversation going on. That's the girly talk, the girly thoughts, right?
Well, that's where the girly thoughts enter in. I mean, you know, lots of times we can have positive conversations within ourselves, but when we're having these negative, conflictual conversations in us, it's probably because there's a message in there that is a girly thought message. If I can give you one from me from this week, I wrote this book, and I very unexpectedly went to the doctor, and the doctor said I needed some surgery on my face. And on Wednesday, I was scheduled to give a major speech a luncheon speech in front of 300 people, business leaders, and I thought about canceling it. And then I thought, that's crazy. I'm going to cancel it because I have a bandage on my face. How would a man approach this? And I thought, well, a man would approach it by kind of muscling through it. He would get support. People would think how wonderful he was, and I thought, well, what's my problem? And my problem was, I thought somehow by having a bandage on my face, I was damaged, and people wouldn't be able to attend to what I was saying. So I didn't cancel my speech. I went in there with many askance looks of, what's going on with her with this bandage on her face, and and I talked about that, and I talked about the fact that I was having a girly thought, and in some ways I was buying into that a man with a bandage or with a scar, because I will have a scar, he's distinguished, but a woman with a bandage or a scar, she's damaged, and that's a girly thought, and it just hits us at different levels, at different points in our lives, but it's in there. It's part of our conditioning.
I know that, in the beginning of your book, you talk about how sometimes, you had just mentioned earlier, you used to be held to a standard from real women, such as Marilyn Monroe, for instance, or it could even be Jacqueline Kennedy. But the fact is that you're held to a standard, and just recently you take a look at movies, for instance, like in The Hunger Games. Here's this young teenage something girl who is able to pull through this devastating competition, but yet somehow still have that compassion, if you will, I guess that nurturance in her because she is a young woman, being able to step up to the plate. But, what if, for instance, you're less than that ideal, and with men, I don't think that they have to worry about the fact that, geez, I'm not Superman, but that's okay. I'm Joe Auto Mechanic, and that's enough. And as you say, society sort of says, well, we'll let you pass. But with a woman being a little bit less, there's a harder standard. So you can see how maybe their inner talk can do a little bit of beating up on themselves.
You got it. You so totally have it. That's exactly what happens. And we do beat up on ourselves. And the problem for women is when we beat up on ourselves, we diminish our power.
Right.
So that's why the subtitle is Mastering the 7 Steps to Personal Power. It's essentially about how we can get out of our own way so we can accomplish what it is we want to accomplish or what it is we need to accomplish. But we trip ourselves up. I did an article recently about, are your girly thoughts tripping you up at work, that lots of women jumped in on, and because we do this to ourselves, and if we can stop doing it to ourselves, and as a secondary thought, then stop doing it to other women, because women do this to other women. They look at we'll look at a friend and we'll say, "Oh God, you've gained weight."
Right.
And where guys may notice it, it's not necessarily part of the opening, hello, you got a gut,
Really?
So it's, so we can,
Well, we've learned through good conditioning through women that, weight is not something you bring up, especially with a girlfriend or a wife.
Right. Well, that's really not a good idea because she's already probably beating herself up, and it's not helpful. There's a wonderful line in the movie that is, I think, speaks to this. It's the movie, and I'm going to get the name slightly wrong, but I think it's Eat, Pray, Love.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, good. And it's Julia Roberts, and she's talking to her new friend in Italy, and they're about to have a margarita pizza. And, oh, God, does it look beautiful in this scene? And her friend pushes it away, and she said, "Oh, I can't eat this. I've been gaining weight." And Julia Roberts nails this. And it was one of my inspirations, if you will, for the concept. And she said, what are you doing? You think that, so-and-so, her boyfriend, is going to notice that you've gained weight? You're naked with him, and he's hit the jackpot. He has a beautiful naked woman in front of him. He's going to say, "I can't be with you because you've gained 5 pounds? What, are you crazy?"
And that's absolutely true. That's exactly how men think.
Right. But it's also how women think, so we shame ourselves. We close down our power. And by the way, we close down our sexuality because we have all these judgments about who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm saying in my book is, girlfriend, get out of your own way.
Exactly. In fact, it's interesting because I wanted to bring something up because you had mentioned about the heroines in the beginning of your book. There was Katniss, and then of course there was the Kill Bill. Uma Thurman is the one that comes to mind.
Yes.
And anyway, the fact is some years ago I did this interview with a woman who writes Western novels. And she writes them in the perspective of a female's experience and point of view in the Old West.
Oh, wow.
And a light clicked on for me, and I was like, this is the kind of stuff that needs to be out there this day and age. And the reason is, when you consider, the Wild West and settling and the pioneer days, we focus on the men, and the nonsense with the shootouts and, how the town sheriff was the hero. But you have to think about what the women had to go through and what they had to endure. They made men look like the babies, in my opinion, and that's a lot of what she wrote in these novels. These were the things women were dealing with, and the men didn't seem so bigger than life after a while.
Yeah.
And that if women would read this and realize, look, I do go through a tough time, but I'm resilient. I can pick myself up and go to the next level and become wiser about, what this thing life is all about, that you don't have to worry about being set up against very shallow and very elusive images of who people think women are.
It's so true. And what happens for most women is that, of course, they are resilient, but they don't consciously see their strengths.
Right.
And they don't consciously see what they're doing for others. And when it comes to, the mental list or the written list that, we all carry around with us, a woman puts her needs at the end if it makes it on the list. And many women don't even have their own needs on the mental list of what they're going to do today. They just don't do it. So they wind up not drawing sustenance from how heroic they are. And that's why I talk about everyday heroism. And we can draw sustenance from, the heroism that we display. We can also draw sustenance from the heroine our sisters and mothers and aunts display. But when we don't identify it, then it's just kind of, it's out there and then it's gone. And so that's why I speak in my book, The Resilient Woman, to have women develop a language of strengths about who they are and what they accomplish. Mm-hmm. And of course we know in our society that a woman who comes on too strong or too powerfully gets labeled certain things. Mm-hmm. And women will ask me, well, what should I do about that? And I say it just comes with the territory. Just know that whoever's calling you the B word, that's really about them. It's not really about you. You know, don't personalize the conflict. Learn to do, in a funny way, more what men do, because men in situations like that tend not to personalize conflict. In fact, if they have a jousting match with someone at work, they may invite them, after work to go out for a beer, or they may, invite them for, a round of golf. They don't personalize the conflict. As women, we personalize the conflict. We're so afraid of not being seen in the way we feel we should be seen that we pull away our power, and with all the consequences that we know. Our federal government is in a big mess now, and what's interesting is if you look at the demographics of who is elected to our government, it's only 6% of our population are represented on all levels of government, and this is mainly older, white, Christian, educated men. And there are so many countries that have so many more elected woman officials than we do.
And I agree with you 100%. And that there's something that really needs to change. And I'll say why I think that's important that you brought that up is because just recently with the Internal Revenue Service, there was the director of the IRS who got into a lot of trouble because she was overstepping her power and having the IRS do things they shouldn't be doing. Now, I see that as a running theme in our government with the women that are in government, is they tend to really want to exert their authority, their power to a point that can seem abusive. And I can see why they have to do that, because when you're saying 6% of the government body are women, 94% are men, there's a reason for that testosterone so-called driven female to kind of go over the edge where she wouldn't need to if there was better balance in the government.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. And also, research has shown that women in positions of power have an incredible amount of scrutiny around their personal lives and about their dress that men don't get. Men aren't painted with the same brush that a powerful woman is. It's a different focus, a different emphasis, if you will, on who they are and what they do. And we see this, if I could take two, very different major elected officials in the U.S. We have, all that Hillary Clinton was painted with when Bill Clinton's affair came out. It was somehow almost in the press her fault. And so all this attention to her and her failings or whatever. And we also see this with somebody like Michelle Bachmann, certainly at the other end of the political spectrum. But there's all this attention on the sexuality of her husband. I mean, this is ridiculous. There are real issues here to be debated, and I don't think, how she treats her husband or how he may treat her has anything to do with this. But if it's a woman that, there is attention to this in the press where there is not attention to men in nearly the same way. And it's just because as you were saying earlier, we hold women differently. It results in a different inner dialogue that women have. And the result is that women pull back and they don't come forward, because to come forward means to be under scrutiny, it means to be under attack, and it means to be labeled the big B. And and it's and we're suffering because we don't have enough new thinking in different levels of government and organizations.
But yet your book paints a very encouraging picture, even though it sounds that, well, here is the stereotype, or here is the thinking out there about who women are and what their defined roles should be in order to be recognized. But the fact is, it just doesn't have to be that way.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to be that way. We can make it different. And in my first book on women and resilience, I was, talking about the issues, and I thought, well, it's pretty obvious. what women need to do. In my second book, I make it really clear. I give, what I call the 7 steps to personal power, and people have asked me, why is your first step about being in a crisis? There are other ways of conceiving of this, and my answer is because when a woman is in a crisis, it gets her attention, and that's about the only thing that tends to get our attention. Outside of that, we put ourselves, next, last,
right.
Not at all. But if we're in crisis, then we'll say to ourselves, okay, we got to figure out what we're going to do. This is bad, and so it requires us to take care of ourselves in a different way. And the reality is, we can do it. We really can do this, but it's an inside job.
Mm-hmm. And as you talk about, too, beginning when you talk about, for instance, you start off with a crisis, is that you shared a story about a young woman in her 30s who divorced from her husband, realized that after they had sold their house on a short sale, so they made no money, he could afford to actually go out and get himself a lower-end house for rent, but she ended up having to move in with her family, sleeping on the floor, decided to take to drinking and trying to search the bars for a man who made more money than her former husband did, and realized at that moment, now this is the crisis, that she was following the same pattern of handling a crisis that her mother did. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we all, our families, the good news about family is that it is the first lab that as children we are raised in. And we study our parents, and those of us who've had children, think back to how your kids would study you, and while you may have thought it was cute that they would, try to talk like you or they use phrases like you, it's because they're modeling themselves after you.
Well, take a look at nature. That's exactly how animals learn to grow and thrive, and we're animals.
Right. So, we learn what love is, and we learn how to find love. And the initial model for love and connection is what we see within our family. It doesn't mean we can't learn new models, and it doesn't mean we can't learn to find different types of connection. But I have seen so many, people who model themselves after their family, and then it doesn't work, and either they then grow and change in their relationship, or they create a new relationship. Similarly, I have seen many individuals who have been married, gotten divorced, and then basically married the same person all over again and wound up with the same problems. So, so it's a question of, can we learn? And learning is really up to us. So I think, we can support each other in learning, and, I'm so excited. I've had many interviews, and it really feels like you have read the book, and so I just want to say I think that's particularly wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. When good work is out there, it's important to understand it, and there are times that I don't get chances to read the book. I'll kind of look through, but because I've dealt with the subject before and different aspects of it, I wanted this to really come out so that our listeners come away from the program going, well, Beyond 50 says they're about solutions, and that's what we're talking about here today. One thing I was going to point out, because you were just mentioning about this person who was married, divorced, then remarried basically the same person. And it's really interesting because what you're talking about in the book is that inside work, that it doesn't matter what you try to replace on the outside, the inside is going to make sure that the outcome is the same because that's what you're familiar with. And that's what you're talking a lot about, is recognizing the familiar things that are causing you the things that you don't want, and to shift those. If the shift doesn't come from the outside, it's from the inside. Give us more insight on that.
Right. It's in one of my first books called 12 Steps to Self-Parenting, which has been in print, by the way, 25 years. So that says something about the durability.
Congratulations.
Thank you on that. I talk about that we all invite in the pain we know to keep away the pain we don't know.
Right.
And we say that in different ways. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. So we all tend to repeat patterns because at least we're comfortable with the pattern. And there's something to be said for that. But when the pattern isn't working, that's when we need to use our resilience to step outside the pattern or to create a new pattern or to challenge the pattern. So therefore we can have an outcome that maybe is sweeter to us, that is, more nurturing to us, that doesn't, on a basic level, doesn't cost us as much. Some of these older patterns, while they're comfortable, are really expensive. Really expensive to us emotionally, maybe financially. But we can create change. But change isn't easy. If change was easy, everyone in your audience, myself included, would be exactly at the weight we want to be. Change is not so easy. So we need to master change by breaking it down and say, okay, what can I do now? And my third step in my book is to set helpful boundaries. And when I was writing the book, my editor crossed out helpful, and she put in healthy, and I crossed out healthy, and I put helpful back in. She sent me a sidebar. She said, we got to talk about what you mean here.
Right.
And helpful, and I find this is an interesting concept. I ask people if what they have done is helpful to them. And if it isn't, then the conversation I have with them is, why are you doing something that's not helpful to you? Not whether it's good or bad, not whether it's healthy, because that's become a new value judgment that women in particular, I think, beat themselves up with. But is this helpful? And if it's helpful, good. But if it's not helpful, then, what else can you do that would be helpful? So I think, part of it is how we frame things. And resilience is really about consciously looking at what I have learned from the terrible situations I have been in my life. And life is full of these situations. I mean, it's not just, things that happen in your childhood. It's, life is full of challenges. All of these, I have a good friend who works for NIH who's without a paycheck right now. And, life is full of challenges. Some you can see coming, some you can't. But what strengths and skills have you used in the past that have helped you through tough times that you can pull up and consciously use now to help you through this tough time? That's resilience. And we all need that, and we can use our resilience to say, okay, I'm going to take this on, and I'm going to begin doing this one differently.
And the interesting thing, too, when you talk about these disappointments that all of us have, there isn't anybody that escapes this. It's just like death. It has a 100% attrition rate. You're not going to escape it. But the fact is this, when you're in the moment of this crisis that you may be experiencing, sometimes I found, and this was something I learned a long time ago, and it's something you actually talk about in a different way, is that take a look back at when you had tough times before and you forget just how bad those times felt.
Right. Because
you're busy experiencing this one. Now, here's even something that's even one step further into what you talk about in your book, too, is that you realize what is your thinking and what is your self-talk in the midst of this particular challenge here. And that there you'll begin to find patterns, and they become very consistent. Let's say, for instance, you have this bill that comes in. If you don't pay it, your electricity is going to be shut off. And you may revert to this kind of a conversation within yourself that says, why can't I ever get a break? How come those guys over there seem like they're doing so well? I'm just never, ever going to get ahead. Things like that, and so forth. And instead, as you talk about and being resilient, you sort of change that conversation for something different. This is something I should have paid attention to before. What I'm going to do is I'm going to call these people now, and I'm going to see if I can negotiate a payment, and I'm going to accept whatever happens, but this is going to resolve itself. That's a quite different conversation, and you will inevitably, as you start getting into the habit of that, this resilient voice, as you call it, then you will start seeing different outcomes even when crises do occur.
You absolutely will, and what I speak about in my book, The Resilient Woman, is becoming almost curious about how you're going to handle it. So even if you're not...
In other words, you can't wait for a crisis. Bring it on, baby.
just wait till someone cuts you off.
That's how Oprah Winfrey became what she did.
Right. But, to become curious about, okay, well, what am I going to do about this?
Mm-hmm.
And then that can create a little space to then look backwards and say, okay, in the past I've done this and I've done that. What do I want to do here? Or do I want to do something in between? But to be, to give ourselves, to realize that no one really can control us. We can create a kind of, we can protect our buttons, if you will, and we can create a buffer zone around us. So therefore, we can have the space to decide how to take care of ourselves, and not be feeling that as women we have to be pleasing, we have to be immediate, we have to make it all go away.
Mm-hmm.
We can say, okay, give me some space here. When I have twin boys, and one of my favorite books to read to them that they totally hated, but they hated this book, was called 5 Minutes Peace, and it was about a mother hippopotamus, and all she wanted was 5 minutes peace.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really sweet book about, her trying to get some space and her kids being sweet and engaging, and at the end, she's in the tub, and they find her and they jump in the tub with her, and it's a lovely book, but it's about setting some boundaries and how hard that is. And but we have a right to have the boundaries. We have a right to have limits. We don't have to be everything to everyone and then nothing to ourselves, because that's what happens.
And wouldn't it be fair to say, Dr. O'Gorman, is that there's the societal image of who we think women are, but the reality of what society really thinks, I think, is actually different than that. Would you agree with that? Or?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We still have these major stereotypes for who women are, and what we don't have are real models. Even in the media for, how women, work and have a family and have a marriage and the juggle, and, how priorities need to keep shifting, and, how do they take care of themselves, and, we don't have really models for that, and things are changing so quickly that our mothers may have been a model for that, but they may not have, because they grew up in a different time. What I say to women, though, is to remember that whatever they are doing, they are modeling for their daughters. Their daughters are watching what they're doing, and by the way, so are their sons. And so if they're having a hard time taking care of themselves for themselves, maybe they should think about taking care of themselves so they model that for their children. Because their children, the first thing we started off talking about, your children are watching. You are their first model for how one, stays alive and thrives. So,
I was just thinking here in the last minute or two about resilience and your book, The Resilient Woman. And as crisis comes along, as you said, that you want to become curious about it. Like, for instance, how will I handle this? What am I experiencing internally? What can come of this, where there is not only a lesson learned, but wisdom, growth, and strength gained from something like this? Because it's like Nietzsche says, that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah, well, there are limits, too.
There are. But what was coming to mind was the magnificent movie $1 Million Baby, Hilary Swank and Clint Eastwood. And for those who have seen it, recognize that she was someone who wanted to become world champion female boxer, and so he decides reluctantly to take her on. But there's a scene she had been winning several bouts fairly easily, and she gets to, a whole new level, and she's fighting this opponent, and she goes back to her corner, and she's winded, and she's tired. She's like, boy, this girl is just all over me. I don't know what I'm going to, we got any advice? And he says, Well, that's because she's a better fighter than you. You know, she's younger, she's stronger. What are you going to do about it? You know, and just put it right on her, and that's exactly what you're talking about here in the book.
Right. What are we going to do about it? It's like when I, this Wednesday, made the decision to give my luncheon speech with a bandage on my face, you know, there was a part of me that was curious about how I was going to pull it off.
Mm-hmm. And how did that turn out for you? I'm curious. Was it different than what you thought?
It was a real growth experience for me because it was better than I thought. As I began talking about the bandage on my face, people stopped looking at the bandage on my face.
Mm-hmm.
People started listening to me. And afterwards, it was a women's luncheon, but of course there were men there. Several women came up and talked about having had similar experiences and not having gone through with the event. One woman shared that she had a similar issue and had a bandage and decided not to go to her 25th high school reunion.
Oh, no.
And still regrets it because, you know, there was a group of people who were so important to her, and she hasn't seen them. And she didn't go because she had a bandage due to the same issue I had on her face. And you know, it's, you know, I think a guy would go and kind of, go and he would probably get lots of people would be sweet to him, and as women would go, well, what's up with her? You know, like she's not doing.
Is he beating you?
Yeah.
Just like a $1 Million Baby, the mother says, "Is he beating you?" No, I'm a fighter, Mom.
Yeah, but it's we assume things, and it's so good to plow through and really see what's there for us, as opposed to assume. I've worked a lot with adolescents, and I remember many years ago, I was working with a young kid who was at a residential facility. He was a pretty violent kid, blah, blah, blah. And we were talking about the word assume, and he wrote it out for me. And it's the first time I saw this, but he said, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me.
Uh-huh.
And he sat back and he smiled. I said, this is so good. And he was right. But, we make these assumptions about ourselves, about what we can do and what we can't do, and we don't want to make people uncomfortable. I didn't want to make people uncomfortable because, not only was my face bandaged, but, one half of my face was considerably swollen. But, it turned out not to be the issue. The issue was the message. It wasn't the messenger. Mm-hmm. And that was good for me to work through for myself, and I think good for a lot of women to see somebody modeling that, because I have seen, heard, worked with so many women who have had a bad hair day, and they redo their hair so it looks good, even if they're late for a meeting, or they go in with a bad hair day and they feel terrible about themselves all day, and it's funny that women have such issues with hair, where the issues men have with hair are much more dramatic than they are with women, and men really don't focus on it. It's not, it may not be something they like going bald, but it's not going to determine their day, or their power, or their status, or their attractiveness. And as women, we get bogged down in this thing that is so on the surface, but so meaningful for all of us.
Now, tell us, I know that we talked about at least 3 of the steps, but here I know we're going to be coming to the end here pretty soon, but what are some daily action steps a woman can take where she can begin to build that resilient strength that allows her to step into situations, as you mentioned earlier, with more curiosity? Like, I wonder how this will really turn out, but I'm going to show up for it anyway. I may not want to, for instance, like with you and the bandage, or unfortunately the other woman with the bandage in the high school reunion, but what will happen if I just show up? What are some daily things that you recommend in the book that they can do to build that strength that's so necessary?
Well, one of my second of my 7 steps is to really listen to what I call your resilient voice. And that's the voice we all have inside of us that usually complicates our life because it's telling us to do or to act or to feel or to think in a way that's contrary to what we hold as the right way to do it. So it's that voice that will complicate things, but we know it's the right thing to do. So it's to really engage that part of us and listen to it and encourage it, because that part of us has a wisdom that we can draw upon. So really listening to that part of who we are. I talk to women, my 4th step is to protect their heart, love resiliently. I speak at conferences. I've spoken at so many conferences at Atlantic City and Las Vegas, and they seem to be conference centers. And I've come to the conclusion that many women love like they gamble. They throw it all on the table. And we need to protect our heart when we love. We just, we can't love somebody else more than we love ourselves. Most of the time, most of the men, and I've done so much marriage counseling, they're not looking for someone to love them more than, they love themselves. I mean, most guys aren't looking for that. So, but women feel they're supposed to do it. And it creates all these contorted things in relationships. So my 4th step is to protect your heart, love resiliently. My 5th step is to realize basically you can heal the parts of you that hurt. And in healing the parts of you that hurt, like the scars we develop, you can actually become really strong in those places because you've devoted extra attention to them. My 6th step is think positively. It's the best revenge. Having a little fun with this one, but when something has happened in the aftermath of terrible events happening, thinking positively is probably the best way of getting through it and moving forward. And if you are dealing with something that somebody else has done to you, it's really a revenge, and kind of like a soft revenge. You getting on with your life is the best way of you showing that other person they were wrong.
And I was going to say too, is that, and you said this just not more than a few minutes ago, is the fact that when you show up, that things aren't as bad as you think they are.
Right.
And that's interesting that we think the worst, and you think, this is our survival mechanism?
Well, it's in part. I mean,
right.
There are many reasons for this. People who have experienced trauma tend to find great comfort in expecting the worst and preparing for it, and that's part of the hypervigilance that comes from having experienced significant trauma. So it's, we all experience trauma to some degree in our life. So, that's almost like a protection that we use, but that's one of those old patterns that's really expensive, because that means we're kind of, at mid to high alert all the time. That takes a lot of energy. And so what I'm, trying to say in this step is kind of think positively, hold yourself a little lightly. Many years ago, a patient gave me a pin as a way of saying goodbye. And it was 2 angels, and the card said, "Do you know how angels can fly?" And inside was this pin, and under it said, "It's because they hold themselves lightly." Wow. Yeah. So Barbara, if you're out there, hello. When we hold ourselves lightly, even though we're in great pain, we can fly. And so thinking positively, even though sometimes we may need to force it. I'm not saying this is easy. If it was so easy, we'd all be doing it. But even if we have to force it, it's a much better way of getting through the aftermath of some of these awful events that happen. And my last step is to really develop gratitude for who you are and what you have learned. All of us have been in situations we dreaded, that we prayed wouldn't happen, that we didn't know how we were going to get through. But they also help shape who we are. So the seventh step is to really appreciate who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And we are people, we are, we are the sons and daughters of those who have chosen to survive. And that shapes us. And so we should have gratitude for who we are and what we have learned. So that's my 7 steps.
And in the end, one daily thing that a woman can do is that she can keep a resilience journal. Tell us about that.
Well, people are wed to their phones, and there are all these notebooks and apps on the phone. So I suggest to women to write down the things, how they've used their resilience, and also what they're grateful for. You can put it can be in your own code on the phone, but it gets you started thinking about what you're doing right, as opposed to the whole long mental list that women have in their head about what they've done wrong and what they still have to do.
Mm-hmm.
I want to start a third list, and it's what you've done right.
Mm-hmm.
And that will help make it more easily accessible the next time you really need it.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think people, especially women, tend to take the road to beat themselves up too much, even over the little things?
I think it's because it's so reinforced in our society. Women don't have a lot of wiggle room.
Mm-hmm.
We are in our society. Your show is about people who are older. We don't have a role for our senior citizens. I many years ago did some consulting in Alaska, and I was very impressed by something I found there. And that is that in Alaska, they were putting daycare centers in what they were calling their pioneer homes. These weren't senior centers. These were pioneer homes because the people who were living in there were the people who helped build Alaska. Well, that's a very different image of aging, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's like, how do we, how can we really hold what is the best in us and not get distracted by all these other, images that are out there, and, develop within ourselves, within our friendship, within our family, other images for who we are and what is worthwhile about us, even if it's not reflected in the greater society. And to do that, we have to consciously do it. That's not going to be an easy one. But we can. Alaska did it in aging.
And on the back of the book, The Resilient Woman, the final question to ask is, which voice will you listen to? Correct?
That is. And do you listen to the voice of your girly thoughts who tell you you're not enough, or you're too much, you're too wide in the hips, you're too tall? Or do you listen to your resilient voice, which helps you make sense of all this and really does coach you? It's our own inner coach into taking the right actions for you, even if they may make other people a little uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Patricia, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program. Is there a website people can find out more?
Yes, there is. It's my name, Patricia O'Gorman, and that's OGORMAN, one word, .com. And there are quizzes on it and things that are interactive and have some fun on it.
And we didn't touch on that, but you've also have a couple of assessments in your book as well, but those are the little surprises people can find out when they pick up The Resilient Woman. I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program. What a pleasure.
Well, this has been a great pleasure for me. Thank you so much.
You bet. Again, the book is The Resilient Woman. Our guest today, Dr. Patricia O'Gorman. You can find out more about that by also visiting our website, Beyond 50, number 50, beyond50radio.com. Find out more there. We also have a free weekly e-news exclusive update for you to sign up and join the Beyond 50 Insiders Club. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is Beyond 50, and remember, live your day past halfway.